Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Bismillah walhamdulillahi nafith alil alameen. In the name of God, and praise be unto God, the exhaler upon the worlds. Welcome to our fifth session of the slow reading of the Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom. This week we're going to finish the chapter of Seth. There's a lot of intertwining and relevant issues here that kind of connect last week's discussion to this week's discussion, etc. And it is a very, very interesting chapter. It makes a prophecy that, in my opinion, is actually happening right now. There have been many interpretations of what this means by the great Sheikh, but we will, when we get to it after I finish the reading, please have your questions ready, and let's have a lively discussion about what we think all of this actually means. So let's pick up from where we left off last week. This is from the second paragraph of page 66 in the Austin translation. So I will start to read now. It is not necessary for one who is perfect to be superior in everything and at every level, since men of the spirit have regard only to precedence in the degrees of the knowledge of God, which is their sole aim. As for the passing phenomena of created beings, they do not concern themselves with such things. Therefore, mark well what we have said. The prophet likened the office of prophet to a wall of bricks, complete except for one brick. He himself was the missing brick. However, while the prophet saw the lack of one brick, the seal of saints perceived that two bricks were missing. The bricks of the wall were of silver and gold. Since he saw himself as filling the gap, it is the seal of saints who is the two bricks and who completes the wall. The reason for his seeing two bricks is that outwardly he follows the law of the seal of apostles, represented by the silver brick. This is his outer aspect and the rules that he adheres to in it. Inwardly, however, he receives directly from God what he appears outwardly to follow, because he perceives the divine command as it is in its essence, represented by the golden brick. He derives from the same source as the angel who reveals it to the apostle. If you have understood my allusions, you have attained to the most beneficial knowledge. Every prophet from Adam until the last of the prophets derives what he has from the seal of prophets, even though he comes last in his temporal physical manifestation, for in his essential reality, he has always existed. The prophet said, I was a prophet when Adam was between water and clay, while other prophets became such only when they were sent forth on their missions. In the same way, the seal of saints was a saint when Adam was between water and clay, while other saints became saints only when they had acquired all the necessary divine qualities, since God has called himself the friend, the praised one, al-Wali al-Hamid. The seal of apostles, as being also a saint, has the same relationship to the seal of saints as the other prophets and apostles have to him, for he's a saint, apostle, and prophet, a wali, a nabi, and a rasul. As for the seal of saints, he is the saint, the heir, warith, and the one whose knowledge derives from the source, the one who beholds all levels of being. This sainthood is among the excellencies of the seal of men, as he opened the gate to intercession. No, let me read that again. This sainthood is among the excellencies of the seal of apostles, Muhammad, first of the community of apostles, and Lord of men, as being he who opened the gate to intercession. This latter is a state peculiar to him and not common to all apostles. It is in this state that he precedes even the divine names, since the merciful does not intercede with the avenger in the case of those who sorely tried until intercession has been made to it. It is in the matter of intercession that Muhammad has attained to preeminence. Whoever comprehends the levels and stations will not find it difficult to understand this. As for favors deriving from the names of God, they are of two kinds: a pure mercy such as a good pleasure in the world that leaves no taint on the day of resurrection, which is bestowed by God, the merciful, or a mixed mercy, such as an evil-tasting medicine that brings relief, which is a gift of God in his divinity, although in his divinity always bestows his gifts through the medium of one of the holders of the names. Sometimes God bestows a gift on his servants in his name, the merciful, in which case the gift will be free of all that is contrary to the servant's nature at the time, or of anything that might fail him. Sometimes God gives in his name the encompassing al-wasi, so that the effect is universal, while at other times he gives in his name the wise, to serve the best interest of his servants. He may give in his name the bestower, al-wahhab, in which case as an unsolicited favor, so that the recipient is under no obligation to render thanks or to perform works to merit the favor. He may give in his name the powerful, in which case the action is in accordance with the requirements of the situation. He may give in his name the forgiver, ghafur, in which he considers the situation or state as it is at the time. If punishment is merited, he will under this name protect the servant from it, and if no punishment is merited, he protects from a state that would incur punishment. In this way are such servants, the saints, spoken of as being immune and protected from sin, ma'asum. The giver is God as keeper of the treasuries of his grace, which only he dispenses according to a prescribed measure through the appropriate name. He bestows appropriately on all he has created, in his name the just and similar attributes. The names of God are infinite because they are known by all that derives from them, which is infinite, even though they derive ultimately from a known number of sources, which are the matrices or abodes of the names. Certainly, there is but one reality, which embraces all these attributions and relations called the divine names. This reality grants that every name, infinitely manifest, should have its own reality by which to be distinguished from every other name. This distinguishing reality is the essence of the name itself, not that which it may have in common with others. In the same way, every divine gift is distinguished from every other by its own individual quality. For even though all derive from a single source, it is evident that one gift is not the same as another. The cause of that is the mutual distinction of the names, there being no repetition on the plane of divinity with all its extensiveness. This is the indisputable truth, which is a very important issue where theurgy is concerned. We'll get to that in the discussion. Such was the knowledge possessed by Seth, and it is his spirit that moves every other spirit expressing this kind of truth, except the spirit of the seal. For his spiritual constituent comes directly from God and not from any other spirit. Further, it is from his spirit, the seal, that all other spirits derive their substance, even though the seal may not be aware of the fact that while in the physical body. In respect of his essential reality and his spiritual rank, he knows it all essentially, whereas in the body he is ignorant of it. He at once knows and does not know, taking on himself the attribution of offices as does the source itself, as being at once the majestic and the beautiful, the manifest and the unmanifest, the first and the last. This coentientia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposite, being his own essence. He knows and does not know. He is aware and he is not aware. He perceives yet and yet does not perceive. It is because of this knowledge that Seth is so named, his name meaning the gift of God, Hikmatullah. In his hand is the key to the divine gifts in all their variety and their relations. God bestowed on him on Adam as his first unconditional gift, bestowing him as coming from Adam himself, since the Son is the inner reality of the Father issuing from him and to him returning. Thus, it is nothing alien to him that comes as God's gift. He whose understanding is inspired by God will know this. Indeed, every gift in the manifested universe is after this fashion. There's nothing in anyone from God as other, and there's nothing in anyone but what comes from his own self, however various the forms. Though this be the eternal truth of the matter, none knows it directly, save certain of the elite of the saints. Should you meet one who possesses such knowledge, you may have complete confidence in him, for he is a rare gem among the elite of the folk. Whenever a Gnostic receives a spiritual intuition in which he looks on a form that brings him new spiritual knowledge and new spiritual graces, he should know that the form he contemplates is none other than his own essential self, for it is only from the tree of his own self that he will garner the fruits of his knowledge. In the same way, his image in a polished surface is not but he, although the place or plane in which he sees his image affects certain changes in the image in accordance with the intrinsic reality of that plane. In this way, something big appears small in a small mirror, long in a long mirror, and moving in a moving mirror. It may produce the inversion of this image from a particular plane, or it may produce an exactly corresponding image, right reflecting right and left reflecting left. However, it is more usual with mirrors for the right to reflect the left. In contradiction to this, however, the right sometimes reflects the right and reversion takes place. All this applies equally to the modes and properties of the plane in which this divine self-revelation occurs, which we have compared to a mirror. Whoever has knowledge of this eternal predisposition knows what divine gifts he will receive, although not everyone who knows what he will receive knows also his predisposition except after he has received, even though he may know it in a general way. Certain theorists, meaning the mutakallamun of weak intellect, have agreed that God does what he wills, then go on to state things about God that contradict his wisdom, that contradict wisdom and the truth. They go so far as to deny contingency as also self-sufficient and relative essential being. The one who truly knows confirms contingency and knows its plane. He knows what it is that contingent and in what way it is so, even though it be in its essence self-sufficient and necessary by virtue of something other than it, as also he knows in what way its source may be considered as other when it makes it self-sufficient or necessary. Only those possessing special knowledge of God understand this in detail. It will be in the line of Seth that the last true man will be born, bearing his mysteries of divine wisdom, nor will such be born after him. He will be the seal of offspring, Khatam al-Awlad. There will be born with him a sister who will be born before him, so that his head will be at her feet. He will be born in the land of China and will speak the language of that land. Sterility will then overcome the men and women of this land, and although there will be much consorting, there will be no bringing forth of children as true men. He will call them to God without success, and when God has taken him and those of his time who believed, the others will remain living like beasts with no sense of right and wrong, given over to the law of the lower nature, devoid of intellect and sacred law. The last hour will overtake them. Okay, first thing I want to address here, before I open the floor to question, is a principle that Ibn Arabi articulates, and this bears a direct relation to the question of theurgy and magic and all that sort of thing, right? He insinuates very strongly that the properties or the principles of a given name of God do not replicate themselves. And this is a principle in the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, that no self-disclosure, no tajalli repeats itself, right? And even in the tajalliyat, the theophanies or self-disclosures of the name. Now, where this gets very interesting is in the question of following occult formulas. Like, for example, you take the book of Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra of Buni, in the second part or the second half of the first book, he has these extremely elaborate formulas of squares and invocations, all associated with each of the divine names, right? On the surface, what Ibn Arabi appears to be saying, and this is something that I have experienced and I agree with him completely about, is the following, that these names and their realities, let alone to take them as properties in a material sense, do not repeat themselves, so therefore you cannot formalize this at all. And this may sound extremely disconcerting to certain occultists, because many people spend years and years and years poring over texts and doing operations and fine-tuning their craft. And with this principle uttered by Ibn Arabi is that you can't do this. You cannot reduce the reality, the haqiqah of a given name of God, even on a practical level, to a formula, because no self-disclosure repeats itself, right? I had this discussion with my own teacher many, many years, over 25 years ago now, and he confirmed it. He says, and the reason is very obvious, is since the self-disclosures don't repeat themselves, right? Therefore, what this leaves with someone on the path who wants to practice theurgy is to practice with the names itself. So rather than, sit down and memorize hundreds of books and manuscripts about the formulas of the names, and you will notice that from book to book to book to book to manuscript to manuscript to manuscript, everyone seems to have their own take on what else will say something else. And then there's the question, about whether Buni even authored some of these elements associated with the names of Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra, and on it goes. But what Ibn Arabi is saying, and what those who have genuine tasting, dhawq, of this reality know, is that you cannot reduce practice of the names and to invoke the reality of the names to a formula of a square and a invocation formula, or that sort of thing. The most that you can actually accomplish is to invoke the names itself and get an experience of that reality yourself for whatever purpose it is. And then this even complicates the issue for a lot of occultists further at the very closing, before we get to the enigmatic part, where Ibn Arabi very unequivocally states that everything that you derive, whether in terms of knowledge or whether in terms of things that manifest in the spatial temporal world, are things that you are drawing out of yourself, right? Or rather, another way to put it, are things that you are drawing into actualization from your immutable archetypal entity, the knowledge, the immutable knowledge that God has of you. On one level, this may appear as a form of predestination, a form of takdir, and it is to some extent, right? But on another level, it isn't at the same time. And this then gets into the very hairy discussion about contingency, necessity, where something can be both contingent and necessary at the same time, which he then instances towards the close of the chapter again. So where magic is concerned, and this was the clincher for me, after years and years and years and years and years spending reading, occult texts and trying to practice this stuff. Some of the operations worked, some of them didn't, mostly didn't. This dawned on me that this is the case, that what my own sheikh said and what Ibn Arabi are saying are just, it's just, commonsensical truth. And so that the most that we can gain from these things, right, is to read what these occultists say, like what Al-Buni says, or, some others say, take it, kind of bracket it in the back of our mind. But unless you practice with the name itself, right, that reality, that haqiqah, will not disclose itself to its actual properties, because it cannot be formalized. And in a sense, this is why I say that the occult can often become a veil for certain people, is that when they fall into these formulaic things, and, like take Al-Buni or some of his other peers as scripture, where practice of the occult is concerned, this is where then they really bury themselves in veils, because unpredicted, the God or the spiritual reality and the spirit in general is the unknown. That is the axiom, right? You cannot formalize God. So in a sense, ironically, those who call the occult shirk are in a sense correct, right? In this approach, like trying to invoke jinn or trying to invoke the names using magic squares. But on another angle, because their perspective is muqayyada, it is restricted, they don't understand what they're actually saying. So they're both right and wrong at the same time, which is, kind of the logic of Ibn Arabi. So practice is the most important element here, right? Rather than theorization or formalization of these things in a theological practice. This is one of the reasons I deliberately chose this text, because the way that Ibn Arabi answers the issues behind the theory of magic and theurgy are unlike anybody else. I mean, you will pore over every single text attributed to Ahmed al-Buni and not come across anything as succinctly and as beautiful as the way the Sheikh al-Akbar is putting it here in the second chapter of the Fusus al-Hikam. So in other words, in your practice of the names or the occult in general, if you take this aboard, right, you empower yourself to actually then bring forth things into the world with that practice, rather than to narrow yourself or constrict yourself or straitjacket yourself in a formula that may or may not work. And usually it may not work for a very simple reason, because whatever formulas in occult texts that we are reading, even if a given author says that my sheikh or someone else transmitted these to me, the fact of the matter is that that formula was the experience of that person or whoever transmitted it to them, right? And if we go by the principle of no theophany, no tajalli repeating itself, there is nothing here to say that the tajalli that was experienced in one setting in that particular formula of an occult practice will replicate itself in another. It's a good maybe placeholder. We consider what it says. Yes, it's very interesting that this text or Buni or somebody else is saying that such and such is the property of the name. But because no self-disclosure, no tajalli replicates itself, rather than follow what these people in the past were saying about their experience or their formula of a given practice, we must gain our own experience of that thing, because our ayn thabita, our immutable archetypal essence, is not the same immutable archetypal essence as those people who wrote some of this stuff down, right? So this is why, and I've been saying this in a variety of different ways to the people of that list on Islamic theology, and I don't think anybody has really understood, because the same questions over and over keep coming up again, is that, magic and theurgy is fundamentally, as it says, the word rohaniya, spirituality. It is a spiritual endeavor, and by that definition, it's experiential. And since it is experiential, and since there are certain principles animate in this universe, it behooves you then, rather than to blind yourself by formulas, to experience that. And this is why the occult and occult praxis in general is seldom ever, at least until the modern times, was seldom ever offered to novices. We didn't have the internet about 20, 30, 50, 100, 200, 300 years ago, where someone can go and download the Shams al-Ma'arif or any other text, occult text out there, and start to practice, right? People went through a rigorous and very methodical program. They were taught certain things. They weren't, even before they were even initiated, they were given certain tasks to do. They would be given kitchen duty or stable duty or that sort of thing. And then after they went through maybe 100, 200, 1,000 days of doing that, only then would they be given hand and initiation by a sheikh. Once that initiation was given, the first farman or command from that sheikh would be the zikr. So they would be practicing with the zikr. Over time, when the sheikh observed their progress, if they were making progress, they would then put them in a khalwa, a retreat. So they would sit in a 40-day retreat practicing the zikr over and over again, and then really, perfect that practice and have really deep experiences, go deep into themselves. And once they had attained a certain level of understanding on the determination of the sheikh, only then certain things would start to be given to them, right? This is a very common, natural way of doing things. Just like for a child, who's a toddler, you don't put them on a bicycle, or you don't give them a skateboard. For the same reason, most people who are not developed at a certain level, who have not developed certain of the inner faculties, should, in my opinion, not be given, the Shams al-Ma'arif al-Buni or similar things, or knowledge of how to conjure jinn and etc., because they don't understand. You're handing a loaded gun, in a sense, to a child. But our times being what they are, this is the reality. And so, and also because human beings have this proclivity all the time to externalize the causalities that are occurring in the world around them, rather than to internalize and see kind of their own role, whether in terms of perceiving what is happening, or their actions, or even their thoughts, as a sort of an agent for this thing that is going on outside of them. Until human beings fully comprehend this, right, then it is natural for human beings to want to externalize. So believing, for example, that they're cursed, that someone invoked the jinn against them or their family, or that they are living under a bad aspect or element of the stars, etc., etc., etc. Whereas even the knowledge of astrology, as we read even in the Vedic astrological text, once you get to a certain level, ultimately, even the astrological knowledge has a completely numerological basis. It has a solar, inner psychological kind of tool. It's not, you're not supposed to take all of this stuff literally and as kind of a formula, not to straitjacket your mind into these formulas of things. These are tools, atlases, guides, GPSs, if you would, to understand the terrain that we're walking, and not the things in themselves. And unfortunately, this is, in this time that we're living in, because there isn't that kind of training available to many people, and many of the teachers themselves that don't have that kind of training, we see interest in the occult, where people are then latching onto the occult because they're either, been turned off by formal religion or whatever, and they latch onto occult knowledge in a very similar fashion as exoteric religionists cling on to the literal narratives of scripture and their creeds, etc. And so the situation is complicated. But here in this particular chapter, in what we just read, Ibn Arabi is laying out extremely succinct and clear theory about what the real situation is, and then, for those who want to draw their conclusions, to apply those conclusions in the way I've suggested here. Now I open the floor, whoever wants to, Reza or Riaz.
Oh, Riaz. Okay. Yeah. So my question is related to what you were just talking about, how the names don't sort of admit that sort of duplication. I'm assuming it's because of the latent predispositions we have. So I'm wondering whether, so he talked about how God bestowed him on Adam as his first unconditional gift, bestowing him as coming from Adam himself, since the Son is the inner reality of the Father, issuing from him and to him returning. So would that same restriction apply to Seth and Adam?
Of course.
Question.
100%. It applies to everything. Just remember, one of the verses that Ibn Arabi constantly quotes, whether in the Fusus or the Futuhat or elsewhere, is Kulla Yamin Huwa Fi Shanin from the Surah Al-Rahman. Every day it is upon some new task. So every day there is something happening, that no moment to moment to moment is replicating itself, and no theophany of God repeats itself in exactly the same way. So therefore, even the knowledge of the name from moment to moment requires kind of a adjustment. We can know a principle of something in a very broad kind of way, but in its detail, what Ibn Arabi is suggesting, and which incidentally even quantum physics is now suggesting, from one moment to the next, there's a variation.
Wow, that's very dynamic. Thank you.
Extremely dynamic. And so we also now understand where, for example, someone like Mullah Sadra Shirazi obtains his understanding of al-Haraka Jawhariya, the transubstantial motion, right? This is coming straight from Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Arabi's insights about these matters. Anybody else? Hussein, Hassan?
Saidi, I would like here to briefly put together two sentences of the chapter. Here I'm reading from the Arabic.
This is what, this is Sayyid Nizam's edition you have?
Yes,
What page?
Nizamuddin. 45. It
Okay.
is the second row from the bottom to the top. والمعطي هو الله من حيث ما هو خازن لما عنده في خزائنه. That roughly the giver, it is Allah who is giving from his treasuries.
Yeah.
So here the impression is that Allah Ta'ala, when he is giving from his treasures.
Yes.
And I want to compare this sentence to the page 48, the third row from the top to the bottom, where he is saying, فما في أحد من الله شيء وما في أحد من سوى نفسه شيء.
Yeah.
That no one
But he
has
says,
in him.
وَإِنَّ تَنَوَّعَتْ عَلَيْهِ الصُّوَرُ.
Yes,
That's the qualifier.
But the stress which I want to put that no one have in us something which is from God, but everything we have, it is from ourselves. But it is at least in the first reading contradiction.
There's no contradiction. He's not saying it's not coming from God. He's only saying, and this is the thing. This is where the non-dual logic is so important to take on board, because this passage can mislead immediately. No one has anything from God as other, as ghayr, as something external to themselves, other than what they have from God from their inner. You understand? Because what we are is min Allah, so from God. So everything that a given Gnostic, brings forth, or a practitioner, Ahmed, whatever, brings out and produces is from themselves, from the locus of their necessity, wajibiyah, right? Ilallah, to God, or lillah, whichever. He's not saying, it is very fine argument. It is wahda al-wujudi, so this is what he's asserting. So what he's trying people to kind of get down from is, it's not as if the case that you're sitting down saying, Allahumma atini X, Y, and Z. Oh God, give me X, Y, and Z, right? And boom, it's happening when you're looking as God as other. What you are praying is coming from yourself. And so the answer is also coming from yourself, in a sense. And even if it is a subtle reality that you don't see, the chain of causality that produces X, Y, and Z, everything, all fruits, and he's making the analogy of the tree, the fruit produced by a request, a dua, or even a salat, it's whatever, is coming from yourself, right? But coming from yourself in terms of the ain athabita, the immutable archetypal essence of yourself, which is the knowledge that God has of you. So the response is from yourself, the request is from yourself, and the response is from God within yourself at the same time. But what he's trying people to kind of, or what he's trying to get the adepts to move away from, is this idea of God as other, or spirit as other, where then there's a kind of a dealing happening as if you're in a market, trying to haggle with God. Because this is the belief of most of the common believers, that everything that we do in the du'as, and we're trying to appease the spirit to do X, Y, and Z for us. And implicitly what this is saying is, no, that's not the case at all. What you bring forth from yourself, which may or may not even happen, we haven't even gotten into that element of the argument yet. Because something could be in the knowledge of God about you, but your failure to act upon it or do whatever, or your wrong attitude may not even produce it, right? That unknown element is always present, even in Ibn Arabi. So, but what he's saying is that when it comes out, when it is produced, it is that knowledge within the mind of God, which is your immutable archetypal essence, which is ultimately the responsible thing for producing or actualizing whatever it is that you have prayed for, right? And so whosoever has this kind of knowledge, right, not just in a theoretical way, but in an actual practice, a real vote of the situation, is the perfect among the saints, because they have realized that to then cultivate the inner life via practice, right, correct practice, is the only way to get anything happening in the world on that level of spiritual practice or on that level of devotion. There's nothing else. You can't appease God, you can't haggle with God, you can't do any of this stuff. Because on this outer level, as it were, on the phenomenal level, that reality of the abd and the rab is still in place. But from the inner reality, that dynamic is malleable. Because from, as he says in the first chapter about your batin being your Lord, being your Rab, right? On that level of the batin, that is God. That is the only God you will ever know. In this life and possibly even the next. The infinite, that wujud al-mutlaq, can never be known. And the wujud al-mutlaq is not something you sit and pray to and say, Ya wujud al-mutlaq, atini mal. Oh, absolute being, give me money. It's ridiculous. This is what Ibn Arabi is trying to say. Therefore, when you go within yourself and you have a practice and you gain knowledge as a result, when you attain that level of your Ein Athab, your immutable archetypal essence, by virtue also of the fact that you have unlocked the locks upon your own being, right? The knowledge as a result of that unlocking, right, gives you access to the causality that makes things happen, because you understand then the causality of how things happen, whether in a general way, as he's saying, or even, if you're really good and you're like someone like, some of the great Awliya or even the prophets, etc., you can gain detailed understanding of what these causalities can possibly become, whether you see it, deduce it, or witnesses in a dream, or whatever modality in which this may transpire for you. So this is what he's saying, and it's a very, very fine, delicate argument, but it is an extremely deep and essential argument as to, in my opinion, any form of genuine esoteric practice, right? And the need to internalize rather than externalize. And this goes for even the dynamic of the Sheikh-Murid relationship in a given context of a Khanagah or a Tekya, whatever, because in the modern times, you see this all the time. There are people who join an order and then they spend that entire lifetime following a given teacher, right? And that's so that then the life of that Khanagah or that Tekya or that order becomes merely the externalization around what that teacher is saying, not the realization of the Murids into attaining that same level of understanding as the Sheikh, if he has it genuinely, so that then they, in a sense, they are liberated from the constraints that has been imposed by themselves over a lifetime on their own fitrah. You understand? This is what Ibn Arabi is essentially suggesting. And then this, especially in my opinion, has application about a theory of occult praxis, about how this works, why it doesn't work, how to understand its working, how to then attain the level of its proper working. Because once you get there, then you can do anything. If, inshallah, right? That's the caveat, if God so wills. But yes, the argument is very fine. The language can be extremely misleading at times. Sometimes you have to read the same line again and again, which I do, whether in the Arabic or in the English translations. Everyone has their own take on it. But what Ibn Arabi is saying is absolutely spot on, because he's getting to the real heart of things in terms of how can we make our practice work. Because as you probably know, a lot of people have experienced, someone comes into an occult or esoteric path. They read all the books, they go, visit the lodges and get initiated into this lodge and that lodge, etc. After a certain time, they get disappointed because nothing is going on, nothing is happening, nothing is producing, their life isn't better, their life is probably in a shambles, their wife has left them, their dog has died, all of those things happen. And that is because what has been going on, even with the accumulation of that kind of rational knowledge, there has been very little internalization of the knowledge that they have gained. And what Ibn Arabi is saying is that, or what all of the Sufis and all of the esoteric masters have always said, this is why rational knowledge and book learning can become a veil. Because until you get to that point that you realize that all of the knowledge that you're gaining has to be internalized and applied to your own life, if you are just mainly gaining knowledge of a theoretical and abstract nature without any further application of that knowledge, then what you're doing, you're still engaged in that externalization process, just in a more sophisticated way than what people out there are doing. And if you're doing that, then you're lost. But if this kind of knowledge and similar kind of knowledge can be internalized, or you come to that perspective that it is internalized, and then find a means and the keys within yourself in order to do so, in order to make it practical for yourself, so then that you witness the contents of what you have learned in your own life, whether on the inner level or on the outer level, then you have attained that level of understanding, and you can do anything. Your knots are untied, and you have realized, in a sense, the prayer of the Prophet himself, Allahumma arina haqa'iq al-ashya kama hiya. At that point, you see how things really are. And so your action and your operations and your approach to things happen on that basis, because you are witnessing, you're beholding things as they truly are, and you're not trying to even change the course of things. You are flowing with the universal nature of things. This is why, in a sense, the theories, like, for example, posited by chaos magicians who believe that anything goes, are fundamentally wrong, even from this perspective, right? Because there is a rule, there are rules, although not the same kind, they're not written rules, but there are universal laws of nature, and then there are, on another level, universal laws of the spirit, and so on and so forth, which the Sharia or versions of it elsewhere are merely the shadows of these universal spiritual laws, that if people live in harmony with, then they can basically live in harmony with God and the spirit and everything else. Anyway, this is what he's saying, and this is why I think if someone studied the Bezels of Wisdom as opposed to the Shams al-Ma'arif, and they would get a lot more out of their occult practice than to sit and memorize al-Buni, because even though Buni offers a very, very interesting cosmological discussion at the very beginning of the Shams al-Ma'arif, he doesn't touch on this sort of stuff. He sort of vaguely insinuates this sort of stuff elsewhere in the Shams al-Ma'arif, but what Ibn Arabi is saying is very clear. It's very clear. This is why these things happen. This is why these things don't happen. This is why your perspective on the occult may be correct. This is why your perspective on the occult is off. And he's laying it out in the second chapter of the Fusus, which I have, when I finally, and I had read this chapter many, many times before, but one day about 22 years ago, it just suddenly went click like that. It's like, right. So this is why these things happen and these things don't happen. And once you, for example, incorporate what he's saying about no tajalli, no self-disclosure or theophany, repeats itself, in a sense, it also is a very liberating thing, because then that means that you don't no longer have to even depend on what these occult masters like al-Buni and similar are saying in formulas, and then what they're saying in its own place starts to make a lot of sense to you as to why they said what they said. Does that make sense?
Yes, completely. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Jeff, do you want to say something?
I don't really have anything to say at the moment. I'm actually still looking at that final paragraph of that chapter, trying to interpret that final paragraph. Where is it?
Yeah, here it is. It will be in the line of Seth that the last true man will be born, bearing his mysteries of divine wisdom, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I lost it here. There it is. Yeah, I don't really have anything to say at the moment or a question. I just keep looking at this final paragraph, and I'm determined to interpret it before we're done, but I haven't
Let me tell you,
have anything to say about it.
for every commentator, there has been one particular interpretation of this. Abdul Allah Afifi, who was the first modern critical editor of the text of the Fusus al-Hikam. Now we have Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmad, but the first one, he completely disagreed with all of the commentators on the meaning of this particular passage and put an extremely esoteric interpretation of his own.
Oh, perfect.
Which is quite interesting. He says, for example, this is the Persian I have here. He doesn't accept the interpretation. He says what Ibn Arabi means from the land of China is the Sarzamine Tabiatas. He is talking about, he means a natural, in a materialistic sense, land. Padid dar alam insan. It's the last element appearing in the human world, which is the qalb, which is the heart of the human being, or the intellect, aql. And whose sister born with him represents the nafs, the ego. Dar sarzamin tabiat, in this natural world. عقل که ممیز انسان از سایر حیوانات است, the intellect, which is what distinguishes the human from the animal, آخرین قوه‌ای است که در وجود انسان پدید می شود, is the last element that appears within a human being. و با سرشکی در برابر آن انسان امتیاز را که بر بهایم داره از دست میدهد. And that what then distinguishes humans from the animals is precisely that very intellect that it has as its last acquisition in the course of its maturation. And how Abu Ala Afifi interprets China is a faraway land. It could be anywhere. It could be Australia for all we know.
Probably.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it probably has something to do with the eastern land, like the Orient, basically. That's my take on the word China, anyway.
Well, Australia is technically the Orient, despite what the settlers. This place is part of Asia for all practical purposes. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
When you go up to far north Queensland, it is only less than 2 hours by plane from here to Indonesia, basically. Okay. So. You could take it in that sense, but this is a cipher, and this is what Abu Ala Afifi has been very deliberate about. It's a cipher, and it is liable to be interpreted in many different ways. I have taken, some of the final things that he says, Ibn Arabi says in the end of this chapter, have a very eerie similarity to our own time right now, as a matter of fact. Even though I am by no means a traditionalist in any sense of that word, nevertheless, what Ibn Arabi says about, people descending to the level of beasts where they don't have any knowledge of either the law or of intellect seems a lot like, the direction that the woke movement, for example, is taking this world in. Where everything is completely inverted. This beastliness that we are witnessing in the worst elements of human nature are being celebrated and etc. As right. And, one cannot but fail to see this in what Ibn Arabi, 20, 30 years ago when I first read this, it kind of put me off. Like, it sounds like nonsense to me. This was 30 years ago. But now, when I reread it, and you can do it in both ways. You can read it both as what Afifi is suggesting. You can read it as a cipher, which each element of it being indicative of other things. But at the same time, you can read it as almost a literal prophecy because it is talking about our time. This is what's going on in the world, almost literally. And he says, Ibn Arabi, where nikah, where there is a lot of nikah, which means coupling or, people having sex, a lot of sex, but without producing offspring. Offspring, you can take this walad in the way that the Ismailis, for example, define the word walad, which means their determination is walad in spiritual text refers to the spiritual offsprings, which is, an element of your own soul. You can take that as love. So there's a lot of coupling in the world today without love, right? And so the children that are being born in this time, right, are children who are born without that essential element of the muhabba, the love. There's a lot of sex, there's a lot of people coupling, populations are growing, but that, that elixir, that red sulfur that made human beings of previous generations different from the ones that are now, by and large, not all the time, not everywhere, but by and large is gone, the love element. So you can look at it from that perspective. And then it ends with that these are the signs of the hour. This is the hour has overtaken them with everything, all an inversion, a complete inversion of values is going on. Someone like Rene Guénon would have a field day with this because this represents the kind of the reign of quantity and the sign of the times. Although I have problems with Guénon and other things, but by and large, I think the general details of what he's saying in that book are correct. That is precisely what's going on. Even though the remedies he's proposes sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. Anyone else?
I guess I have a comment, or it's like
Sure.
more of a comment than a question.
Go ahead.
I guess what you were discussing earlier about, the internalization of this sort of methodology, I guess it doesn't only resolve what you were saying about the occult, but it also resolves the whole very hot, contentious issue in Islamic theology about tawassul and istiqatha, that sort of thing, because you are your own intercessor. So would you agree that
100%.
it kind of, the whole debate is kind of, gets resolved, I guess, in that statement as well?
For an arif, for someone traveling a path of suluk in Allah, wayfaring towards God, this is absolutely a resolution. And it forces you then to internalize the matter increasingly. There's that famous poem by al-Hajj. Elsewhere, Ibn Arabi quotes this. He doesn't really quote this in this Fusus al-Hikam. In his Fuduat al-Makriya, he offers a commentary on it. But in the commentaries on the Fusus al-Hikam, all of the commentators bring this poem, very famous poem of al-Hajj up, where he says, he whom I love is I, and we are two souls in one body. There is such a profound truth in what is being said. I mean, the common exoteric believer takes this as scandalous. Oh, he's claiming to be God. What Ibn Arabi is doing throughout this text, in the beginning of the chapter of Adam, is that he's saying, yes, well, why is this such a surprise? This is the truth of the matter, but that doesn't just apply to one person. It applies to all of creation, especially the human creation. And then what he's doing is then taking this as a collective truth, individually located, and then offering the recommendations and advices of what then the Salik, or what the Arif Billah, the Gnostic in God, can do with this kind of information to deepen their own practice and to understand the situation much, much better than they were understanding it previously. But yeah, you're 100% correct that this applies to tawasul, to any kind of dua, to any kind, and even the contents of the salat itself. Because let's be honest, what possible benefit does your prayers, your salat, your adherence to the Sharia or non-adherence thereof, what difference does it make to the wujud al-mutlaq, to the absolute being? It is the height of arrogance and even stupidity to suggest that it even makes the slightest difference to that, So all of this is actually for our benefit, in a sense, not for its benefit. Its benefit, in a sense, is only to contemplate itself within the locus, which is yourself. Otherwise, none of this has even the slightest effect on that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, but it's just interesting to see that it answers so that one statement and that one little bit answers so many different debates and questions, and it really makes things a lot clearer, and it actually brings a lot of I guess hope in the individual. Like you don't have to, find the perfect correct path or master or whatever. It's always something that within your own time, your own life, your own circumstances is accessible, and that's something that's echoed I know a lot by other traditions, but it's also good that Ibn Arabi stresses that as well.
And he lived it, and this is the important thing about Ibn Arabi. I mean, I've read the lives and biographies of a lot of these Sufi saints, and all of them are exceptional and amazing. But what distinguishes Ibn Arabi as an extremely interesting case is that Ibn Arabi had many teachers. He traveled, his experiences were extensive. He was both and he studied, and both in the outer world and the inner world. He was extremely cosmopolitan in every conceivable way. Whereas you have a lot of the masters, whether of the past and after him, who were very, they would never leave a particular place that they were at. So they would grow up in a town or one or two towns and then end up being there their whole lives. And then throughout the course of their life, they would attract students and etc. Not with Ibn Arabi. He born in Murcia, traveled all around Spain, then North Africa, then back to Spain again, then left Spain, went to North Africa, went to Egypt, went to Mecca, came to Damascus, went to Konya, went to Malatya, went to Baghdad, came back, went to Mecca again, then came back to Damascus, and finally died. All over in the course of 75 years. That's for the 13th century. That's quite a bit for one person. And he was cosmopolitan in his outlook, and his teachers were numerous. He didn't have a single human teacher. And the one that approximated the teacher that he thought was the ultimate human teacher was Abu Madian, who never actually even met physically. He only met Abu Madian through either Abu Madian's works, the correspondence they had together, or through the intermediary of Abu Madian's students. But he never met him. So he claims that his primary teacher began with being the Rohaniyat, the spirituality of Jesus, alayhi salam, and then Moses, and then Khidr, and then finally the ultimate teacher, who he claims his head rests upon the heart of, is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But today, or at least since about, let's say, the 12th, 13th century, most Sufis have been affiliated with an actual silsila or with an actual master. So it's very interesting that a figure like Ibn Arabi comes at the very tail end of the more, let's call it the more democratic era of Sufism, because subsequent to him, and maybe not just in the immediate or maybe 2 or 3 generations after him, this is where we find this process of what the sociologists call the routinization of charisma really setting in, and the Sufi orders are organizing themselves, each is becoming kind of its own product and variety, and so the doors of that kind of going back and forth and sitting at the feet of multiple masters, etc., closes in a few generations after Ibn Arabi. And even though he didn't found an actual silsila akbariya, the way that Ibn Arabi's transmission continued was through this element he calls the khirqa akbariya, which itself derives from none other than Khidr. So the khirqa akbariya is a Khidrian, not a super silsila. So it's a very Uwaisi kind of silsila. It is not. It's not in the way that the traditional orders have been operating from the 13th century forward. In a sense, what occurs to me is that it's almost it's almost like a special creed above what we understand as the Tariqa Sufism of the time, and that, in my opinion, this is probably one of the explanatory things about why the teaching of Ibn Arabi had such an amazing impact throughout this Tariqa culture, whereas Rumi and his Masnavi had an impact and influence beyond even the borders of Sufism. Ibn Arabi's Fusus and his writings and his overall thinking, basically, in a sense, the history of Sufism from the end of his life to pretty much today is so many footnotes to Ibn Arabi, and everyone who came, including a lot of his detractors within Sufism, like Al-Dawla Semnani of the Kubrawi order, or Sheikh Waliullah, or Ahmad Sirhindi, or the Naqshbandis in India, all of them, or then the Sheikhi school of Sheikh Ahmed Ahsai, in one way or another, they're responding to Ibn Arabi. And even what I find extremely fascinating about this dynamic is that even the detractors themselves cannot but escape the influence of Ibn Arabi. So they are almost compelled to use his own terminology in a lot of things. I mean, he was truly the Sheikh al-Akbar. I mean, this is not hagiography. It's not, I mean, the influence of Ibn Arabi is so pervasive in the tariqah and the esoteric culture of Islam, that it is impossible to escape it. And it's a good thing, because I think the perspective that Ibn Arabi had, in a sense, like this name Nafith, the blower, this is the Nafas al-Rahmaniyya itself. It infused, and especially because immediately after the death of Ibn Arabi, or during the time as he was aging and about to pass the world, the Islamic world encountered this Mongol onslaught that, in my opinion, had it not been for figures like Ibn Arabi and Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi and similar of the Mashayikh and the awliya of that time, the culture, that the blow and the pressure that the Mongols exerted on the Islamic world would have been such that it would have broken it completely. I mean, can you imagine an Islamic world without Ibn Arabi or Jalaluddin Rumi or any of these great Sufis, and instead Islam had only produced a figure like Ibn Taymiyyah, Astaghfirullah al-Azim. There would be nothing left of it today. It would have gone out of history a long time ago, truly.
I would want to ask a second question here.
Sure.
When it is brought to the subject of ism, or let's say of Ma'asum, that
That's a good question. Yes.
each case that
This is such a
in the
great nugget. This is such a great nugget. Let me just read just that paragraph again, okay? It's in English from the Austin translation. He says, "It is not necessary for one who is perfect to be superior in everything at every level, since men of the spirit have regard only to precedent in the degrees of knowledge of God, which is their sole aim." This is an extremely subtle and important and key point. And if people understood this, a lot of the problems that we have experienced in spiritual cultures, not just in the Islamic world, but elsewhere, would have been resolved. One manifestation of this in the modern time, and even previous to it, is that a certain circle of people puts their master on such a pedestal that it is impossible to emulate, and a lot of it is just exaggeration. It's qulu, it's not true. What Ibn Arabi is doing, and even though the disciples of Ibn Arabi and generations after him created all these hagiographies about Ibn Arabi himself, what he's saying here is important. You find a true teacher, and you serve that teacher by virtue of their knowledge of God, not whether they're fart smells or doesn't smell, or not whether they make, errors of judgment in very minor things of this of a worldly nature. And he had given that example last week when we left out in the last paragraph, the two examples that he gave in the lifetime of the Prophet. And this, in a sense, is even in contradistinction to what, for example, in my opinion, some of the more fabricated hadith that we have in the Shia collection say about the Imams, where the Imam is born into the world with his umbilical cord already gone, and the first words uttered out of his mouth is Subhanallah, Rabbil Alameen. This stuff in the Shia corpus of hadith, as if the laws of nature are arrested for these godmen. Whereas Ibn Arabi is humanizing these figures, whether it be on the level of the messengers of the prophets, or whether we're talking about the awliya of the tariqah. There are humans. In the Quran, through the mouth of Muhammad Rasulullah, is already saying this. Ana basharun mithlikum. I am a human being just like you are. I have hopes, I have dreams, I answer the call of nature, I eat, I drink, I'm a man, I get, aroused by women, I get, I have needs. I'm just like you, and I make mistakes. I may, write something, there might be a typo in something I write. Don't use such things as your gauge to judge a man of God. A man of God is judged by his knowledge of God and by his ethics, right? Not by these, very, these dunyavi things. And this is a very, very, very good piece of advice, and it shows the utter sidq, the sincerity of Ibn Arabi on this particular question, because the natural instinct of most people on a spiritual path, and not just even in an esoteric setting, but even, and especially in an exoteric setting, is to take the teacher and just project all these perfections on them and turn them literally into a taghut, an idol, where the teacher is perfect in every conceivable respect, material and spiritual alike, without them realizing that what they're doing, and this is the real shirk that is happening when they do things like this, because that kind of kamal can only ever belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nothing else. So that the perfection that is to be sought by a novice looking for a teacher is not in these external and irrelevant areas, but in the knowledge that that particular teacher has of the reality of God, and also their own ethics in the matter, whether they do as they say or they're going to do, even though there might be lapses from time to time that they don't realize, as we are human.
So here we can bring where he says later that he is in the same time the one who knows and the one who doesn't know, and the one who understands and the one who doesn't understand, because I always thought about what is the meaning of isma within the Shia framework. And this makes very much sense, that the hakika of the Imam or the Prophet, which is the spiritual hakika, completely agree that he's perfect. But when he is to his corporeal and material existence, that this is completely normal, that he's governed by the same natural laws that other people are also governed.
And he says it explicitly in the Quran, and so do the Imams, and occasionally in a lot of hadith, including sometimes where you read on one level, Ali or Imam Jafar, Sadiq, or any of the other A'imah, alayhim salam, they say, Nahnu wajhullah, we are the face of God, or, Ana babullah, Ana ainullah, all of these things, but at the same time, then they humanize themselves. In a very particular instance that you see this happening with the Imams is in the Kitab al-Tawhid of Khulaini's Usul min al-Kafi, on the particular hadith that Ali himself then explains, where he says, Arafu Allah billah, know God by God, right? In an explicit way, on the surface, he's not telling people, look at me. If you want to know God, just look at me. Nothing else. He's not saying that. He says, you know God by God. And then he says, by God, he means the totality, right? He's talking about, God itself. But obviously, Ali himself is Masharullah. He's the locus of the manifestation of God. So then you kind of take the hint. But even onto and what he's doing that, so you find this dialectic happening all the time. And so I have found recourse to two things in the Imami hadith corpus in understanding these, these theopathic hadith. Number one, the first discourse of the Nahj al-Balagha, where Ali very explicitly says, to know God is to strip the attributes of God. So that is the apophatic element of it, right? Which then entails that in order to know the reality of the Imam, you strip the physical and material element of the Imam from himself. So then what are you left with God? Okay. The second is obviously the Hadith Kumail, or the Hadith al-Haqiqa, the conversation between Kumail and Ali alayhi salam. Those are the two keys that allow me to read the Imami Hadith and to understand this dialectic without getting, as most people would read them on the surface, say, oh, Ali is saying he's God outright. No, there is an equivocation here, and this equivocation is extremely important because it establishes a dialectic. So a man God can be a man and it can be a God. And this is where this whole necessity contingency marriage in Ibn Arabi is such an important argument to understand these theopathic elements even in our own hadith corpus, and understand at what level is the Imam speaking. So when, for example, Ali in that collection of Kulani is saying Ana Babullah, Ana Jambullah, Ana Ainu, I'm the eye of God, the gate of God, side of God, hand of God. That element of it is the Wajibiyah speaking. But Ali himself is the Imkaniya element. And so now we begin to understand how something is necessary through God and contingent within itself from another angle. You see? And it's these two particular elements of Ali's discourses that really, really helped me to then read these Imami Hadith themselves. And also, another thing, I also use these two elements even in my own method of how to distinguish an authentic Hadith versus an inauthentic Hadith. So I use a sort of a method of kashf with these two elements as the basis through to which I distinguish what is what. I take Ibn Arabi's advice and Sheikh Ahmed Ahsai's advice about kashf as the method of authenticating hadith as the only method that works. They're right. Two figures of the Islamic world seemingly in opposition, advising the same technique, because this is not in this this kind of methodology that the Rijali methodology that we find amongst either Sunnis and then the Hozavi Shias is just in my opinion is ridiculous. And you do scalp so much just based on who passed on what and whether his reputation was good or no, whether he had qulu or didn't have qulu, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the methodology that I've established for myself, is that first discourse in Nahj al-Balagha and also the Hadith al-Haqiqa, as the method to then, what is saying what. And also I use within the mat of a lot of these Imami Hadith, key words that jump out at me in the Hadith from the mouth of the Imam, I put to numerological calculation, and then I find the correspondences, and this is how I then gauge the authenticity or inauthenticity of a given thing that says that it has said.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Anyone else? No? Okay. We'll leave that here for this week. So
Sheikh, in such case, I will be very unrespectful for one last question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So just on the figure of Shith alayhi salam, what it is in the Sethian Gnosticism, that the trio, the three sons of how much they are, but let's say the three main figures which are son of Adam alayhi salam, Habil, Qabil, and Shith alayhi salam. That the symbolics which place there, and how would you comment that Habil and Qabil, the two brothers, one who kills the other, that
Cain
you
kills
have
Cain
the active evil, the one who kills the other, but the other is also not right because he voluntarily accept to be oppressed. And that the dialectic, the Shith alayhi salam, who in some narrations is born as the soul, son of Adam alayhi salam, who was not with a twin pair, that he overpass this dialectics, that he is not the transgressor, but he is also not the one who allows voluntary to be the victim. How would you,
That's
what would you say?
That's a very interesting and very good point, because this is what happens. You know, the one who perpetrated and the one to which the perpetration happened, in a sense, are equally, from different angles, blameworthy, in a sense, right? One to perpetrate, another one to have the perpetration happen to them. Cain kills Abel. So this is a very long discussion, but the resolution, the synthesis between these two polar dialectics, the perpetrator and the perpetrated, is Seth. And that is why, in a sense, one can infer that he is the gift of God, because Seth, as the transmitter of the knowledge of Adam, as Adam's wali, is the one who manages to transcend this dialectic in order to then transmit the mission of Adam himself to the future progenies. Whereas these two, and you know, Cain especially, then, you know, at least on the exoteric narratives about Cain, the progeny of Cain end up being wiped out by the deluge. So once, you know, a couple of generations into the future with Noah, it is the people of Cain, or the progeny of Cain, who are then responsible for the persecution of Noah and the people of Noah until the deluge comes and wipes them out. But we can take this figuratively and esoterically as a very important instruction, in the sense that the true man of God, which here is Seth, represents a kind of a removal from this dialectic of the perpetrator and the one to whom the perpetration is happening. This is a very, very, very good point that you raised. So what that is what is required, because one who is removed from being the perpetrator and the perpetrated can then act upon the world in a positive way. Whereas the one who perpetrates is obviously acting negatively, and the one who is perpetrated, if they live, who then end up basically propagating the perpetration, you know, in order to get redress from the perpetrator. So then this whole dynamic of, you know, he did this to me, I did this to him, which is we're witnessing today in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Jews, once again. This cycle doesn't end. It just feeds off of itself. Whereas with the figure of Seth, and it's very, very interesting that this name, one of the meanings of this name, even in Hebrew, means Hibatullah, the gift of God. What can we then read and learn from this about what this archetype of Seth represents as kind of a separate thing from this perpetrator-perpetrated dynamic? You put your finger on a very important issue. It's something that I think we should think about. The commentators, other than one or two of them, don't really explain this, which is very interesting to me now, that you don't find an extensive discussion about this very thing in the commentators of Ibn Arab, because all of them knew the story. You don't find this at all in much of the Jewish or even the Kabbalistic literature. Baba Ruknuddin Shirazi, kind of in a couple of lines of his own Persian commentary, puts his finger on what you just said here, but very briefly, and then goes on to the next topic. But this is a very important thing to meditate on, because what it does is that basically then it gives us an archetype of the God-man who is both mindful of these two dynamics, but also separated from it at the same time. Will not perpetrate like Cain did, will not be perpetrated like Abel, who is then completely taken out of the picture altogether. Anybody else? You're welcome. Okay, Let's begin reading the chapter of Noah. The zikr associated with this name is Subuh, the glorified. So you can start to use that name now, Ya Subuhu. And we will read the first half of this chapter as of next week. And this chapter will also be a 2-week chapter. And the course is great. I'm getting a lot of feedback from people. One particular participant said that the issues that Ibn Arabi is discussing thus far that they've read of the Fusus is almost obsessing them during the course of the weekend. They can't think about anything else. Well, this is one of the reasons why we are having this course, because Ibn Arabi does have that effect. And once once he gets his claws into you, he doesn't let go, which is a good thing. He has much to teach us. Anyway, we'll leave it here for this week, and we'll meet up again the same time next week. Until next week, Yallah.